While celebrating hope and transformation, that's what it's all about in Christ. And that is a perfect introduction to what my guest and I are going to be talking about shortly. Now, my guest is David Sawler. He is the team leader of a church ministry in Nova Scotia and founder of Goodbye Generation Ministry. He worked for over a decade as a youth minister. His book, The Disciple, God's Blueprint. It deals with the question, what does it mean to be a good disciple? Where do we look and what are the resulting fruits? It also covers brave territory like what is wrong in the church today and how can it grow? David, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here today.
David, it intrigues me that, and this is my starting point, the youth in our church today. It intrigues me that you've worked with youth for over a decade. And from a lot of the discussion I'm hearing, and this is even what we do in our World Report, and we've mentioned that on Huntley, it's about the youth and they're our future. Where are they going today? Can you give us any insights on what you would like to see developed with the youth in our church today?
Well, I do think a lot of churches are definitely struggling with their young people and keeping their young people. And even on this topic of discipleship, this may, I don't know if it's a crude example or not, but we have a lot of churches and even people who want to be involved with making kids, but not everyone wants to be a parent. And when I think about of all the children and youth in our churches, it really takes the adults of the church, not just to be happy that they're in a building or a program, but to actually adopt kids spiritually and to be parents to kids and help raise kids. Because it's not our job just to produce kids, it's our job to raise godly mothers and fathers.
Now that is very deep what you just said, because virtually what you're saying is that we've got a lot of hurting kids, hurting children in our churches today, and we need to rally around them and help them grow.
Well, the amount of, if a young person is in a church, whether it be a child or a young person, and if no one really takes them on like that, they have a person in their life who's pouring into them, praying for them, and actually takes an interest in them. The amount of people, if they don't have a family member in the church, the amount that actually stay, it's almost less than 1%. And the idea of that we need to pour in to our youth, not just that we're happy that they're there, but that's who we are investing in.
Now we're looking at an interesting vicious cycle that we could be faced with here, because so many of us as adults, we had terrible childhoods. We didn't have the model that we needed to become who we needed to as adults. And here we are, left to mentor our youth. Now your entire book is about discipleship.
Yep.
And it's about that transformation in the Lord. But first we need to understand what that transformation means through discipleship in Christ.
You know what, even the transformation that, I think something that really God spoke to me about, and I've had some people do it for me, but even just looking at what Jesus did with his life, that he surrounded himself, I guess many people don't think about this, surrounded himself with a group of young people. Many people don't think of how old the disciples were, that perhaps between 14 and 21, and some of them very young. I don't know if anyone knows exactly the ages, but here's Jesus, and this is God's plan. This is who he chooses. And you know what? Transform the world by pouring in to that generation.
You have some very interesting concepts in your book, and one of them is, although Christ preached to thousands and thousands of people, when you look at who his disciples were, it was a small number. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think some people could look at what Jesus did and think it was a failure that he had, he preached to so many, but then there's only so many followers. You think after he ascended and there's only so many left, to think, well, where's all these crowds? But I think in God's wisdom, Jesus was doing something that was going to bring long-term results. And so often we're trying to do like a big show and do all this stuff. But if you look at what Jesus did with his time, sometimes we read the Gospels and forget who Jesus was speaking to most of the time. You can read the book of John, for example, and think so much of that book was him speaking to those closest to him. And I think there's so much we can learn. Sometimes we look at Christ's likeness and we just think of all the characteristics of Christ, like loving and stuff. But sometimes we want to pull away and not take in what Jesus actually did with his time. And I think what Jesus did with his disciples is actually part of being Christ-like.
So you're saying that we try to look at Jesus' actions, we try to look at his character, which is very necessary for discipleship, But there's something that we need to carry more, and that is what your book talks about, relationship.
Definitely. Here, this may be, I think it's a foreign concept for a lot of people even growing up in the church. Jesus called his disciples friends. I know, like, even in the Old Testament, you have this theme, he's the friend that sticks closer than the brother, but even here in John again, when he's with his disciples, one of the things he says is that I call you friends. And, you know, even in being in ministry, I think I've grown up and in a lot of settings hearing, you know, you can't be friends with the people you're ministering to. But you know what, that's so contrary to what Jesus did. He actually called his disciples friends.
Now you're going to have to tell us how to do that, because this is an issue that we keep hearing cropping up in the church, that we wear a facade.
Definitely.
There's a lot of competition in the church, which you also address in your book at some level. And when we look at the friendship issue, you're a leader. Friendship requires sharing, but it also requires vulnerability. What are other people going to think about you? Are they going to accept you as a leader? How do you overcome that?
Well, it's a little bit scary because you have to be honest. And I think this has a big impact on this generation, because if you talk to a young person or a young adult, what do they want most? Well, authenticity is what they say they want. So when you think about this thing about friendship and openness, it's not just about, you know, being destructive and throwing stuff out there. I think there needs to be wisdom in everything. But there's something about being honest, even in our struggles, and just some of the pain that we go through with other people, that it actually helps bring healing to people when you can be honest and open with others.
Now, if somebody were to ask you, can you lay out what it is, the characteristics that represent what a true disciple in Christ is, what will you tell them?
Someone who could actually sit down with someone and the people they're working with and say something that Jesus did, and it would be this, that you will do greater things than I. Because I've thought about this so much. Here's Jesus sitting down with these created beings, and he says this, you will do greater things than I. And sometimes we can look at that and think, well, look at all the things I'm going to do. But this is what I think is right at the core of discipleship. It's not about that I'm going to have all these people following me. It's that you have the ability to look at the people you're investing in, and your prayer for them is they are going to go farther than you, and they are going to do things that you've never done, and God's going to give them a double portion of everything that he's given you. And so it's not about how many people are following you, it's how many people you're pushing ahead of you.
David, we live in a culture today that's very materialistic. It's in a lot of pain. People are in a lot of pain. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to see beyond that pain. To be that disciple that you describe, it takes a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
How do you encourage people?
Well, it takes involvement. You know, just 2 days ago, I was gathered in a chapel at a hospital in Sydney, and there's a really strong community of young adults, Christian young adults in there, and one of the young men passed away, Rob, the other day, and his family's there. But it was just incredible to see, I don't know how many, 50, 60 people, you know, crammed in this chapel praying. And you know what, there's something beautiful in that, because it was community coming together even in difficult times. And there's something, and I think that's something that we miss, that discipleship and that having that friendship. Like, the church is meant to be a covenant community. There's so many things in scriptures that don't make sense. We don't have that. When we think about that, we're to pray for one another, encourage one another, love one another, think of others above yourself. Like, you think about what all those things are that we are to be to one another. If we can be that, and I just saw that, just living that out the other day, and seeing how, you know, people come together like that. But it's a beautiful thing when all that happens.
Now, this is an area where we all struggle with. There is a cost to that discipleship.
Yeah, you know, it's messy, and a lot of it, I think, it means you're gonna have to give some things up, and it may not be the things you think about, but you stop striving for your own kingdom, because all of a sudden it's not about you, it's about someone else, and so some of the cost is you getting out of the way. And because in all of us, it's just human nature. Like, we want to be in front, and we want to do this, all these things, but it's about putting yourself, it's not about putting yourself down, but it's lifting others above.
And it's also human nature to think, I want to know what the results of this is going to be.
Yeah.
And you talk in your book about the fruitfulness, the fruits that come from being a disciple of Christ? Share that with us.
Well, I think beginning to understand, looking at the life of Christ, it's just transforming you. You get into the Word and looking at just understanding who Jesus is. I mean, it affects you. But also, I got to say, being able to see not just someone hear the gospel, but see their lives transformed, and you pour into them and then see them out, whether they're doing ministry or just living for God wherever they happen to be. I'm telling you, there's something incredibly rewarding for that. And at the same time, it's sometimes painful, because when you really get out there and get involved with people's lives, there's going to be people who that everyone doesn't accept that. And so it's probably the most rewarding thing, and maybe the most painful thing, the more involved you get.